Welcome to the Contrarians, and tonight we have a full panel. The topic, how horrible are supergroups? Like I said, the panel's here. We're ready. We're going to talk about this. How horrible are supergroups? Let's go.
Welcome back to the Contrarians. This is another Patreon suggested topic. The idea here is how horrible are supergroups? This was suggested by Phil. We got a big panel assembled here. So we're going to go through this, the good, the bad, and the ugly of supergroups. What are the positives? What are the negatives? But yeah, we've kind of thought about this a little bit, and we're going to give our views on this idea of, does this whole idea with supergroups work or not? Are there great examples? Are they usually kind of vanilla? Are they lousy? So that's what we're going to do today. And let's turn it over to Phil. And I guess you can kick us off since this was your idea.
Thank you. Yes. So I was saying before already that, I mean, I never thought of any supergroup that I listened to as particularly horrible or even as a supergroup per se, because I just simply listen to some of these bands because they have members of other bands that I already like, because and maybe they have a sound and style that is already similar to those other bands, or simply there are certain artists in those bands that I already admire. So I'm sort of I gravitate towards those so-called supergroups. But recently, well, not recently, but in 2023, at some point they announced the creation of a supergroup. So already the announcement was like, here's a new supergroup, and it's called Elegant Weapons. Well, not created by, but featuring, let's say, first Richie Faulkner from Judas Priest, who is an exceptional guitar player, great musician. He's basically, he's covered for one of the greatest heavy metal twin guitars in history, and he's doing an exceptional job at it. So I thought, wow, a supergroup featuring Richie Faulkner, and on top of that, also members of Accept, Ronnie Romero, who has sung for MSG, Rainbow, etc., so many more, and also members of Uriah Heep. So I thought, wow, so many musicians from all these great bands. And when I listened to it, I thought, it's a bit run-of-the-mill. It's not really so super. And I thought, what is so super about Elegant Weapons? And that made me go back to some of the bands that I listened to, which were marketed way back when as supergroups. And it basically just got me thinking on this idea of, are supergroups basically like a marketing trick? Do they give that label in order to just sort of attract a certain audience because of that label, regardless of what the band play and I don't know. So that is my reasoning, my initial reasoning on this. I don't know to what extent they are horrible or not. Maybe some of them are great, but there's too much marketing behind that with that label of super. The first thing I'll go with, I think it's kind of obvious if some of you have already listened to me talk about Prog. Basically, I've selected here some of the super groups, let's say, or some of the side projects, maybe that's a better term, of Mike Portnoy. I'm a big Dream Theater fan. And the first one I would go with, of course, is Transatlantic, right here. As you can see already on this very first album, Transatlantic, they have the names of the members. So the first album is called SMPTE, and that's Roy Stalt of the Flower Kings, Neil Morse, Mike Portnoy, Pete Trewavas of Marillion. So already, you have the names of those people there, as though to really say, here is this bunch of great musicians all getting together to make some kind of side project that's also like a super group, because these are all, well-established musicians who are very exemplary of their movement, of this prog, neo-prog rock, late 90s prog rock, prog metal. But I still remember, being a teenager and really listening like crazy to Dream Theater and to anything that was labeled as prog as well, and just being naturally gravitating towards this album, the next ones, and this is like prog rock turned to 11. Everything is super epic. Everything is long durations. There's the whole gamut of prog rock. You know, the highs, the lows, the emotional stuff, the crazy musicality. You know that you're listening to Mike Portnoy because it's his exceptional kind of drumming. You know that you're listening to Neil Morse. It has his particular style that you've been used to from Spock's Beard, and the bass and the guitar playing of Roy Stolt. It is a supergroup in many ways because they are doing something that they've already been doing, each of them separately, but really turning it to 11, so to speak, the prog meter, if you like. So what else there to say about these guys? I mean, in particular, what's interesting about Transatlantic is that they represent a particular branch, if you like, of prog rock, which is a Christian prog rock, because Neil Morse, who basically writes all the lyrics, he's really like the driving, that he's like the engine of this band and many other bands he is in with Mike Portnoy. He became born again around 2002, shortly after 9/11. And that really was a turning point in his career, in his life. And a lot of the content of Transatlantic and other bands of Neil Morse and Mike Portnoy is basically based on the Bible. I don't know, anything that's related to being born again Christian. So that's it basically. Recently they released a live album in Paris, which I was at that concert, so I'm very proud to say that I am actually in their latest live album in the audience. It seems that they have probably disbanded because now Mike Portnoy is back to Dream Theater, and I think it's going to be out of the question that he plays with many more of his so many projects. Some of them supergroups or not, I don't know. I give it back to you now.
Right, Grant, you want to take over, moderate?
All right, here we go. So I'm just curious. Martin may be able to answer this question, but a supergroup, was that terminology come up by the fan base, or was that something that might have did that come out of like, well, Blind Faith, as far as I know, was like the first supergroup, but was that a media thing or was that a fan thing? Do you know anything about that, Martin, how that all generated?
I don't know when the actual term first happened, but it's a pretty easy thing to apply to bands. I mean, Led Zeppelin was a supergroup. Cream was maybe a little bit of a supergroup as well. Yeah. So I think it goes back a little bit. I mean, I'll just, I guess, say my piece next, I suppose. But yeah, I just wanted to mention OSI as well.
Yeah,
that's one of the props I took out in terms of this Prague area. And UK, of course, there's my fully signed Danger Money.
That's great.
But basically, yeah, I mean, I took the approach with this just to talk about it in a general sense. One thing I did for Goldmine recently was the top 20 supergroups in reverse order, right? And I remember going through this exercise. I've got it up on the screen now, feeling that the end sort of result was that I'm generally, there aren't a lot of these that I love a lot, right? And you think of the problems with them. I mean, I'll just go in reverse order what I had here. So I had Asia. I took out that prop here. There's my Asia. So I had this down at number 20. And ones I didn't talk about were like Chicken Foot and Them Crooked Vultures. But, you know, as I went up, I had Audio Slave, Queens of the Stone Age at 18, Lords of the New Church 17, Blind Faith, Derek and the Dominoes, Velvet Revolver, Temple of the Dog, OSI. I put at number 12. I love OSI. Fantomas, A Perfect Circle. So, a Tool, branch off. UK, I had at number 9. So now we're into the top 10. I had down at number 8. Emerson, Lake and Palmer at 7, Traveling Wilburys at 6, Bad Company at 5, Cream at 4, Crosby, Stills and Nash at 3, Black Country Communion at 2, and then I had this band at number 1. So this version of King Crimson I had at number 1. So wow. I love this as a super group, as Bill Bruford, Robert Fripp. I mean, they'd worked together before, but Tony Levin and Adrian Belew had their thing going. So rather than get into too many specifics besides that, I would just say that I think the reason why supergroups can be underwhelming are you've got all these egos coming together. You've got generally a pretty open season for squabbling about songwriting credits. You might have different managers. you all kind of want the spotlight. We know the famous GTR discussion about, dueling guitarists and stuff like that. When you're listening to these bands, you're distracted by the personalities in the band. So the band's personalities are distracting you as well. Phil, you mentioned side projects. Sometimes you get the gripe with side projects that maybe these aren't your best songs. You've kept your best songs for your band, or your band is bringing the hammer down, saying, "Don't you take our best songs over there." And then you get in trouble with your band when you do that, right?
Yeah.
But these guys they didn't grow up together. Managers, labels are putting them together. They're not from the same country or the same part of England or whatever, right? Or part of the UK. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons I think they don't work. But when I went through that exercise, I felt like I had to get up into my top 6 or 7 to even say I really like these bands a lot, or the top half, put it that way, kind of thing. And I was not raving in a huge way about too many of these bands other than King Crimson and Black Country Communion. But I don't know. That's my piece.
All right, cool. Well, we're supposed to have 3 picks. I'm not exactly sure we can get through 3 picks, but since we're already on this top row, I'm going to throw it over to Reed and get his thoughts on this. And we'll just try to keep it loose and just have a discussion. If we can get through 3, we will. If we can't,
Okay. Well, so I'm going to throw out a couple of different conceptual pieces here. Then let me start with this little factoid for you. The first supergroup was the Justice Society of America. That was in Action Comics number 3, printed November 22nd, 1940. That is relevant. I am not throwing this out as a random fact.
That's why I've got my Batman t-shirt on.
Oh, nice.
Yes, but that was not, he was not in a super group now. The first time that I know of that the term supergroup was applied to music was in Rolling Stone magazine in 1966, applied to Cream. So why is that relevant? It's because the music journalist is taking the language of superhero comic books and applying it to music. Nerds are nerds. It's just a question of where is your fandom. So as soon as people have an unhealthy interest in something, you're talking about people sitting down and people are saying Eric Clapton is God. Well, what would happen if Eric Clapton got together with Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce? Oh, they would produce this group and call it Cream. It would be a super group, right? Well, some people, I love some songs that Cream did. I thought they produced some absolute crap, but some of it's awesome. And that's the super group experience, right? But the term is so disingenuous because jazz bands had been composed of individual, just absolute maestros for decades, individual maestros, but you didn't think of them as supergroups because the bands were identified almost entirely by the band leader. So if you were talking about Tommy Dorsey's band, it didn't matter that he might have 10 or 15 absolute master players in his band. It was Tommy Dorsey's band. So no one was going to call that a supergroup because he had the best trumpet player in the world and the best drummer in the world and the best trombone guy in the world, right? Even though that might have been the case at any particular time. That term didn't come about until rock music, and that's because you had kids listening to rock music and they had that superhero mentality from reading comic books. So they brought that mentality across from comic books to music, and now you're mixing up your nerd genres and you get super groups, okay?
Yeah. And there were other things as well. There was a mentality through the 60s that you didn't steal other people from other bands. You stayed with your band. You didn't split up bands. That's why it's horrible when Beatles split up. You didn't split up the band. You didn't leave. And that was another thing. So when Cream comes along, it's a new thing because they go from different groups and form another group. And they do it in a jazz way because it's more like a blues jazz thing. Like for instance, you have Duke Ellington, Charlie Mingus, and Max Roach doing an album in 62, 63. And that is considered very, very high standard of jazz playing. And you have, so that was around in the jazz world, but not in rock world. So I think that was another, but that is very interesting because that wasn't, as you say, that wasn't called the supergroup. That was called another combo, a side project, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
But I think you're right with the anomaly of superheroes, because that was what these people were considered to be.
I think you could argue that John Mayall's Blues Breakers was a supergroup, but nobody called the Blues Breakers a supergroup, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm just throwing that out as your conceptual piece. There's something for you to consider. Talking about three bands that I would argue are various types of supergroups. I'm going to go over this real quick now, having said my conceptual piece. The supergroup that defined the 80s for me is, now this is my cassette of Hearing Aid, the Stars Project, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so now to what is a supergroup, right? So they did one song, and honestly, I don't think it was a particularly good song, but as an accomplishment, it's astounding. It was put together over a weekend. People who had never worked together, they just threw it together. You had everybody who was anybody that wasn't Black Sabbath or Ozzy, because Dio had spent the last couple of years slagging those guys off in the press as hard as he possibly could. And there was no way they were going to work with him. And they just all got together. And, you had Adrian Smith and Dave Murray from Iron Maiden on rhythm guitar. Everybody who had ever played lead guitar on a heavy metal album in the 80s playing solos, singers. One of my favorite vocal performances from Eric Bloom in the 80s is on Stars, and he only gets 2 lines, but man, he just freaking goes for it. It's not a good song, but it has some amazing performances if you get the entire song, and it's 80s heavy metal encapsulated in one song, and it's such an astounding achievement, and I'm so glad it exists. For all of that, it's, like I said, it's not a wonderful song. But
could you describe it in comic book terms?
It's like if back in the day, you would get an annual, and an annual is like the worst story you would get all year. It's not the regular artist. It's like a B grade story, but it's twice as long as you would get in any of the regular comics. So you would have to pay twice as much money for it. And you're like, oh yeah, okay, I'll do this and throw it in the collection, and it won't be worth anything, but I'm glad I have it. Moving on a little bit, Martin already mentioned them, but to me, to be a real supergroup, they have to have been put together specifically new, because I think these days the idea of a supergroup is pretty much meaningless. So many musicians are old and they've been replaced. You've got bands that are made up entirely of non-original members. So you have to have a band that's custom built out of members of other bands, right? And they have to make new music. That's very important. And then Black Country Communion is the #1 supergroup out there for me. And Afterglow is my favorite album by these guys.
I had them a number 2 Reed out of 20. I love those guys. Yeah.
If you're looking for Sabbath / Zeppelin style rock, these guys, I'm hot and cold on Joe Bonamassa. I don't care for the blues that much, but Black Country Communion is the band that proves the man can riff rock.
Yeah.
My only dig against these guys is I think Derek Sherenian is completely lost in this band. They just don't give him, I'm sorry, I've got a cat invading my space here. They don't give him any space to perform at all. I don't know what they're like live, but on album, I'm like, why did they even have a keyboardist on this band? That, and I don't think the songs that Joe sings are quite as good as the songs where Glenn Hughes sings. Glenn Hughes, he's my guy. Now, my final one is a ringer, and that is more or less the entire output of the catalog of Frontiers SRL. They're like a company that 90% of their output is modern supergroups, which now, of course, you record over the computer and email your files back together. Most of these people never see each other. They're never going to tour. And their music is, I don't know even how it's distributed, but it's sold to guys who love 80s metal. And every once in a while, they'll put out an album that's pretty good, but most of it's pretty middle of the road. But it gives me a chance to bring up Jorn. And yes, even though you would say, Jorn, that violates your own rules, it absolutely does. But this album was made with, I always want to say Pink Cream 69, but that's not true. Voodoo Circle was his backing band for this. And Voodoo Circle in itself is a supergroup made up of members of other groups who primarily record for Frontiers SRL, including members of Primal Fear and Sinner and other groups. And it features Alejandro Del Vecchia, who is also a producer for Frontiers SRL. The whole thing is so meta, it's bizarre. So there's a supergroup that I really enjoy because it's a guy who takes the concept of a supergroup and actually produces a pretty good album. So there's a concept where it can work, where you've got an established artist taking the supergroup concept and making good music, whereas most of them where you just get, as Phil was saying, you know, you get all these players together in a room and they can still produce really mediocre, middle of the road music. And at the end of the day, you really don't care about it. And that's the downside of supergroups.
And the thing is that if you look it up online, the first thing it says about, let's say, Elegant Weapons, supergroup. You know?
Right. Because they're selling you the name, not the music. That's the downside of supergroups.
I agree with that.
And that might be me having said that because I wrote the bio for that album 2 years ago.
Did you really?
Damn it, Martin, for God's sakes.
When it was a secret, like it was a secret for a year after I wrote the bio for it.
Wow.
No, I'd check that band out.
Well, heck, since Reed did his 3, we might as well see if we can all work our 3 in. I don't really have anything. Well, I do have something because I think what I'm going to talk about, no one's going to talk about it. Pontus, let's throw it over to you. Give us your 3.
All right. I'm going to start with something that a band that Martin didn't have in his list, and that is Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young.
Actually, I had them at number 3, Pontus.
You had them at number 4.
Yeah.
I wasn't listening.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I might not even say it, so.
But they are okay.
Yeah.
Shall I do it again? We can.
No, go ahead and talk about it.
Okay. This is a band that just morphed into this trio that morphed into this heavy dysfunctional quartet. It starts out with Neil Young and Stephen Stills being in Buffalo Springfield. They are quite a underground band in Los Angeles. They have a hit. They make 3 wonderful albums, but they can't hold it together because everybody is running away and doing other stuff. So Stephen Stills is then a bit out of work, and another person who's a bit out of work is David Crosby, who has a major fallout with the Byrds after recording the notorious Byrd Brothers in '67. He's actually replaced by a horse on the cover. The interesting thing is they get together and they write songs together, and what happened is that the Hollies is in Los Angeles in early '68, and Graham Nash meets up with these 3, and he decides to move to USA. So there is one of those connections that I talked about. You don't steal from other people's bands, because that was unheard of in the UK. So when these guys come over and just tells him to go with them, the Hollies are horrified, and he leaves his family and goes to USA and meets Joni Mitchell and all that. But they made the first album, and they make Woodstock, and then they go on tour, and then they need another guitarist. So Ahmed Ertegun for Atlantic Records recommends that Neil Young is a part of it, and then it is Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And we got Deja Vu, and we get this sort of great Grand Canyon sort of major players getting together and making at least one album that is so in the zeitgeist. Deja Vu, where everything falls into place. It's the launching pad of Neil Young. It's the bigament of hippiedom. And it's just a fantastic record. Of course, here's another thing about supergroups. They never can stay together because the egos are too high. Yeah. So what happens is that you later on get Crosby, Stills, Nash, you get Crosby, Nash, you get Young and Stills doing a record. The other three doesn't want to work with Neil Young. Neil Young needs the others, and he spirals off to in his own solo career, and then they show up on each other's records and they write songs about each other on each record. It's very sort of incestuous, So they really represent one of the leading factors in supergroup sort of mentality. You don't stand each other, but you still do great music together. And this has been going on for the last 50 years until, finally fell out together in the early 2000s or 2010s. I highly recommend David Brown's book on Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Read it. It's a very fun and tragic story, but it's well worth reading. My second one is Emerson, Lake and Palmer. This was course, from different UK bands. You have Keith Emerson from The Nice. You have Greg Lake from the first incarnation of King Crimson, and then you have Cole Palmer coming from Atomic Rooster at the time, and he had also played with Arthur Brown, which was a huge live act and had a hit in '68 with Fire, of course. And what's so interesting here is that they actually took the supergroup is also the fact that they do bombastic music. They do it all stops pulled out. And you play Prokofiev, you play Mogoslavsky, you play, the 1973 album is an epic that is it's not one side out, it's not one side track, it's half of side one and whole side two, the Carnival thing. And of course, there's another of those things. You have a group that stays together. I used to call them the band that really burned from 70 to 73. And then you had the band that totally burned out from 77 onwards. It was, it worked in a certain period, right? Mm-hmm. But it slowly but surely felt old hat as other things happened. And my third, I want to talk about Cream and Blind Faith in one thing, because that is one thing that we mentioned when journalism and egos and managers and all these things get together. And here again, you have three musicians, two of them hate each other to the point where, they were in the Graham Bond organization, Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker was, and both wanted to play with Eric Clapton, but they didn't want to play with each other. And still Rob Stigwood got them together, and they produced, I think, a very good, a few good albums of psychedelic rock. What is a problem with Cream, of course, is that they release their first single 2 months before Jimi Hendrix, and as soon as Jimi Hendrix comes along with his trio, these are playing second fiddle. But if you want to experience Cream in a very good way, I recommend you listen to. There's a relatively new live set called Live 68, which is the last tour they made. And then they released an album called Goodbye. Listen to those live things, because they, the interesting thing here is that they actually could play off each other. They could actually do something relatively well. And then, of course, they went, Eric Clapton teams up with Steve Winwood, and Ginger Baker bumps into them, and they can't tell him to leave, so he stays on. And they have Rick Rich from Family, which was an underground band, relatively big in England at the time, and they make a great album. it's a one-off, but it's a very good one-off. Unfortunately, nothing worked with them when they went to tour, and they disbanded very quickly. And Clapton went, solo first with Derry and the Dominoes, and then solo with Eric, right? So and Winwood went back to Traffic, and so did Rick Reach. But Ginger Baker played all sorts of things later in the 70s. But these are my favorite bands at the time. I think the 60s were like that. The big me decade meant that these groups could be huge success, because you had that sort of, at the same time you have the old major solo albums by these people, and so it went from the group, your local group, to being this sort of major star things when you got people together, and there's others as well, but those 3.5 is my pick.
Oh, nice. Excellent. All right. Thanks, Pontus. That was incredible. Let's throw it over to Tom. Tom's been throwing up props the whole damn show.
I pulled a lot of records. I was just like, supergroup. Oh, that one. Yep, that one. So I pulled a lot of stuff. So, right. But one thing I was going to say is just to start my little diatribe here is that, bands don't necessarily like to be called supergroups, because it puts a lot of pressure on them. I mean, that's, before these people, these bands even put out an album, they're already being called super. And I mean, that to me is before, that's a lot of pressure. And, everyone's like, oh, we're going to make tons of money with this band, and this is going to be massive. And it's like, wait a minute, time out. We haven't even put an album out yet. Hold on a second. So, and then secondly, I didn't always know that these groups were super groups. I mean, I didn't know Graham Bond Organization. I didn't know John Mayall. a lot of these English super groups, it's like, okay, these were bands that, some of these bands that they came from, I didn't know them. So until later when I did my, found out more, did some research. But so I'm going to stay with bands that were like, super groups in real time for me when I was in high school. So the first one that I'd like to talk about, because I'm such a huge, I was a massive Zeppelin fan. This was given to me on my 10th birthday. And I was like, oh my God, Led Zeppelin put out a new record. My best friend gave it to me for my birthday. I played the hell out of this album. And I was like, oh my God, Zeppelin, in real time, I'm buying a Zeppelin album as it comes out. And then of course we know what happened shortly after that. I don't think I would have seen the tour or anything, but I was remember thinking, Robert Plant came out with solo records pretty quickly. Pictures at 11, and which I enjoyed quite a bit. What was the second record called?
Principle of Moments.
And
yes. His band's kind of a super group too, right?
Yeah, Phil Collins and Barrymore
Barlow, Cozy Powell, Robbie Blunt, Jazz Woodruff, they're all coming from somewhere. So.
What a great band, yeah. So, but I was like, "Where's Jimmy? What's going on with Jimmy?" And Coda came out in '82, I think, and then this came out in I don't know what 82, I think as well. He did the Death Wish 2 soundtrack, which is an interesting listen. But it wasn't a band. It was like, okay, that's kind of like a soundtrack. That's not really. So I remember when I heard about this band coming together, I was really excited about the Firm. I was like, what? Jimmy Page and Bad Company and Led Zeppelin in one band.
If I may, I think you guys did a Dark Horse panel on that album.
Well, we did the second album.
I think we did the second album for
yes, you guys did Mean Business.
Yeah,
which I missed. I was supposed to be on that, so that's why I want to talk about the Firm. I missed that one. So this album was, it's at the time I was so into this. I used to draw this on my math notebook and stuff when I was bored in class. I would be drawing this logo all the time, and I was very excited about this album when it came out, and at the time listening to it all the time. These days, I listen to it now. It's pretty good. It's got moments. It's not, but it wasn't. It's not really. People always underestimate the drummer. I mean, John Bonham's not in the band. I mean, I think that Jimmy Page and John Bonham had like a they had like a simpatico that was just unbelievable and very hard to replicate. And Chris Slade, I think, is the drummer for the Firm. He was good. He ended up playing with AC/DC, and he's a good drummer, but he wasn't John Bonham. And then the bass is like Tony Franklin's playing this sort of like fretless bass the whole time. He's like doing these
great.
slides. Yeah, and he's great. I mean, he's awesome. But he's doing all these like slides, and it's just it's an interesting sound. It's very different.
Tom, I wanted to say, when you die and show up at the pearly gates, St. Peter's going to go, Tom, your school books. I think that's the only time I've ever seen the Firm logo drawn on a school book.
It's a good point. I've never seen that either.
Maybe you're right. Maybe that's probably not a band that people were drawing much, but but I also drew the Stones logo. I drew the tongue and stuff too. But so anyway, I do like this album quite a bit. I know you guys did an episode on this album, and I do like this album quite a bit. I think there's a couple of great songs on here. And there's one, Fortune Hunter, and you probably mentioned this, was an XYZ song that, ended up on this record, or at least the part of it was. And Chris Squire joked later that said, "Oh, well, I didn't sue because the album didn't do very well." So apparently Chris Squire had something to do with that riff. So I would say that the Firm was, it was funny because it was not. There was a lot of hype when they came out and when they went on tour, and I think the tour did pretty well, but it wasn't, as much as I enjoyed the band, there wasn't a lot of excitement among my friends, or, oh, wow, they were amazing. It was like, I think people were expecting Led Zeppelin Part 2, and it just wasn't that.
Tom, basically they're the poster child for the bad idea of making a supergroup, right? It's like, what could go wrong? The Firm.
Yes.
Answer, right. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But I was such a Page guy. I was like, oh, listen to Page. He's got this. He's doing the bends with the Strat, and I mean, some of this stuff sounds like In Through the Outdoor or Presence, or there's like little moments where you're like, oh, if you're a Zeppelin crazy like me, I was like, oh, this is great. But I wouldn't say these albums have exactly aged that well. So that's the downside, and they did not live up to the hype. In my opinion, they didn't live up to it. Really.
I thought Radioactive was a great track, though. Jimmy's guitar playing on that.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I don't think the rest of it could maintain that level,
Well, I mean, to me, I don't know if you guys how familiar you are with this, but that You Lost That Love and Feeling, I remember like, oh, I just don't, why did they do that? That was like, what is that? That just did not belong on
trying to compete with Hall & Oates, probably.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I was just a bad choice of song for me. I was like, what? Yeah. So anyway, I would say that one, and then I'm going to do one other one, and that is a band that people don't talk about that much, Humble Pie. That they were a supergroup, that they, Frampton came from the Herd, Marriott came from the Small Faces, and the bass player Greg, I think his name is, he came from Spooky Tooth. I love this album, Rock On. I love the early Humble Pie stuff with Frampton in the band. They did some good stuff without him, but it became more of like shouting R&B, rock, hard rock, heavy, which is great. I mean, I love that stuff too, but I do like when Frampton was in the band, they had a little bit of light and shade. Frampton would bring the acoustic stuff and be more, and that was why he ended up leaving, because the manager was like, hey man, forget all this acoustic stuff crap. Let's get Steve Marriott in the middle of the stage shouting and screaming with heavy guitars. And they did, I Don't Need No Doctor on the live album, and it exploded. So
it's a great live album.
Oh yeah. Yes. I have to, Rockin' the Fillmore.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah. Who does it? I mean, this is, and I love when he does the singing introductions.
Yeah.
It's like, who does that? He's like,
I prefer the Steve Marriott of the Small Faces as opposed to Humble by Steve Marriott. At least his voice isn't all blown out.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, so those are my two choices for now, the Firm and Humble Pie. Everyone's mentioning all of the other ones, but those are my two.
Those are good. Nice. All right. The Parish of Rock.
Oh,
you're up. Parish, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Sorry. I thought
okay. You're up, Parish.
I thought Tom was going to say something.
Oh, Tom, you going to say something?
I was just going to say one more thing really quick, was that one of the biggest disappointments, I meant to mention this earlier, I'm sorry, was one of the biggest disappointments supergroup wise was GTR was like,
oh, that's a horrible record.
Yeah.
Come on. I was not psyched about that.
You know, I have it on good authority that their album is better than Asia.
No, that's crazy.
No.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of got them
no.
tied, but the winner of all of those by far to me is UK. I think UK was an awesome supergroup. So.
Oh, absolutely.
UK
Agreed.
top notch.
Agreed.
Go back and watch that episode, people.
Yeah.
I still think Asia's much better. Plus, remember that when Asia, there you go. But you remember
album was
that John
weak.
Wetton quit, but he came back and they put out, what, 3 or 4 records with Wetton? Some of the best stuff Asia ever did when they all reformed. What was that, like in the 2000s?
Yeah.
Killer stuff. Killer.
You know, Grant, somebody told me that. I haven't listened to it, but someone else said that too, that it's actually really high quality stuff later.
Yeah, BMG put out like a CD box set of all of them. And I don't think it's that awfully expensive and it's still in print. Pick that up because it's just got all of them in a box. It's
You know, everybody's smarter later, right? You aren't going to be
Right.
Poppy Asia of the second or third album. You're just going to be, you know what your fans want at that point. You're all in your 50s and 60s. You're just going to make an awesome, cool album with all the latest, technology, and you're going to be proggy and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of like not surprising that later Asia would be really good.
Yeah. So there
sorry
you go,
about-
Tom. Do yourself a
about that.
favor.
I'm now
That's
done.
all right. Do yourself a favor and pick that up and then
All right.
report back.
Will do.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Awesome. All right. The Parish of Rock. You're up.
Okay, so going back to the theme about how horrendous are supergroups, I'm not a big supergroup fan. So the first and the main reason for that is, I think, in my mind, most supergroups comprise of washed up has-beens that have seen better days, and they kind of leave the band that they were in and move on to and try to get back former glory. So the first band I'm going to talk about is one of those, I guess. And when I first heard about them back in 1990, when I read it in Kerrang, I just couldn't believe how bad this band was going to be. And that band was the damn Yankees. So you've got Tommy Shaw.
Okay,
Out
now
of
come
Sticks.
on, Parish.
Out of Sticks. You've got
Come on
Night
now.
Rangers who used to be really good, but Jack Blades has left them in disgust. Ted Nugent hasn't done anything for 10 years, nothing decent anyway for 10 years. And then you've got some nobody's ever heard of as the drummer. And why? What's the point? Why would you bring those together in 1990 when grunge is coming in? Why would you do it? And there I am.
Well, they didn't know
I'm
grunge was coming in, though.
Well, it was kind of happening, wasn't it?
Not in 1990, though.
But then all of a sudden I hear Coming of Age on the radio. And I think it's fantastic. I absolutely love the song. And they are actually my favourite supergroup. And I just don't think it should have worked. Everything about them should have failed. The ego. Can you imagine Ted Nugent mixing it up with those soft rock guys? That just shouldn't work. The ego shouldn't work.
Wait a
And
minute,
yet
soft rock
it
guys.
does. Yeah, they are. They are.
Oh,
But Ted Nugent,
Parish, for God's sake.
That AOR stuff was soft rock for Ted Nugent. not maybe for everybody else, but for Ted Nugent. And yet the ego wasn't there. There was no ego. There was fun. The fun came through. And I think it's a great album. That first album, I think, is a great album.
The first
and
one.
I really enjoy it. I think it's a great album. And it went on.
How many albums
to
did they make?
Well, they
Good.
did 2. They did
Don't
3.
Tread is the other. Yeah, that's the whole.
But it's
shelf.
unreleased.
That's true.
And
Yeah.
there's a whole story. We did a show on Damn Yankees on my channel.
I
It's
know
all
you did.
there, ladies and gentlemen.
I
Please
know
like
you
and
did, which is-
subscribe.
Grant's Rock Warehouse.
Which is why I thought I'd be provocative with my first choice.
Oh,
So
Damn it,
I
Parish.
think they're really good. I don't think it should have worked. When I first heard it, I thought the egos the egos have landed kind of thing, and it wouldn't happen. But I think it's great, and it was double platinum as an album. It had a number of hits. It was probably the last of those type of bands before grunge really kicked in. And then 2 years later, they do a second album, which I don't think is as good, but I do enjoy it. I think it's a decent album. I just don't think it's as good as the first one. But again, it did reasonably well. I think it was gold. It probably went top 20, had a couple of hits. And that definitely was at the time of grunge. So So its success compared with what certainly I thought it would be, I think was pretty good. And I think the other thing that's surprising, well, sorry, it kind of sums up the supergroup is that they tend to be mayfly type bands, that they don't stay along for a very long, short lifespan. And I think that's the case with most supergroups. And I think that certainly was the case with Damn Yankees. What I find interesting now, though, is how many clips there are on YouTube of 2 or 3 of the members getting back together and playing a couple of songs at gigs. So they clearly still get on. They clearly still are friends. And yet, for some reason, they've never come back together to do an album. So
It'll never happen.
No, probably not. But as I say, they seem to still get on quite well. And I mean, even quite recently, I think Ted Nugent turned up at a Night Ranger concert and they played a couple of Damn Yankee songs. So that's my first one. The second one is in my view probably one of the most unusual supergroups of all. They were a band in the late 70s. They had hits on both sides of the Atlantic, both in albums and singles. They released 6 albums in total, but only 1 album was actually released under the band's name, and that band was Rockpile.
Yeah.
So 3 of the albums were released under Dave Edmunds. 2 of them were released under Nick Lowe. As I say, 1 of them was released as Rockpile. So they're a supergroup because certainly in the UK, Dave Edmunds had a #1 in the early 70s. Nick Lowe had come from Brinsley Sports. Billy Bredner, who's the bassist, and Terry Williams, the drummer, were kind of well-known session musicians at the time. And then you add in there as well that on the albums, you've got Huey Lewis guest starring in a few songs. You've got Elvis Costello in a couple of songs. You've got Graham Parker in a couple of songs. So I think as a supergroup, that's why I'd class them as a supergroup, but unusual because of the fact that actually I don't think many people would think of them as a supergroup. And as I say, actually only 1 album was released under the Rockpile name. And I think it sums up another problem that supergroups quite often have, which is the record contracts. Quite often bands have to come together and the record companies get in the middle. And certainly the problem with Rockpile was Dave Edmunds was signed to Swan Song, Nick Lowe was signed to Stiff, and they wouldn't allow them to sort of formulate this supergroup and release it separately. So they did it the way they did it under their individual names. So that's my second one. My third one is really to challenge what do we mean by a supergroup. So we spoke earlier about the fact that it has to be members from more than sort of one band. It has to be a new band. It has to be new music. But how many members from a former band can there be for it to be a supergroup? So if you think of Bad Company, you had 50% of that came from 3. If you go to Velvet Revolver, 3/5 of that came from Guns N' Roses. So my last one is actually a supergroup where 3/4 of the band came from one band. And are probably, in my mind, a supergroup more with the benefit of hindsight. And that band is Alter Bridge. So Alter Bridge, 3/4 of Alter Bridge are former Creed. The bass player walked out halfway through the second album, I think. The other 2, Mark Tremonti and the drummer, left after the 4th album. Creed, obviously huge in the States, never did anything here in the UK, huge in the States. But they formed Alter Bridge. Miles Kennedy joined from the Mayfield 4 and was in great demand at the time. In fact, he was being chased by Slash to join Velvet Revolver at the time, and started an entirely new band, no songs from Creed, musical style very different, and have now sort of 13, 14 years later, no, probably longer than that, 20 years later, you've now got a band in Alter Bridge. And you've got Mark Tremonti has Tremonti as a band. Mark Tremonti also does Frank Sinatra swing band that he tours around the world with. You've got Miles Kennedy with the solo stuff. You've got Miles Kennedy with Slash and the Conspirators. So you've got all of these other bands, which are proper bands. They're not side projects. They're proper bands, multi-albums, touring all over the world. And yet all those players come together as Alter Bridge, which is why I say maybe with the benefit of hindsight, they kind of fit the Alter Bridge. Fit the sort of supergroup description. So yeah, so I thought I'd throw them in there just to challenge what do we actually mean by a supergroup.
Nice, very cool.
Super cool, awesome.
You know, it occurred to me while I was doing research. You know what else would kind of fit that same mold? Whitesnake.
Yeah. I think when I thought about it, I almost went with Rainbow as a supergroup.
Ozzy Osbourne.
Whitesnake, Ozzy Osbourne,
kind of.
and I didn't because I felt that they were too recognised in their own right as the band that they are, rather than kind of as supergroups. But certainly when I was thinking about what do we challenge as a supergroup, Rainbow and Whitesnake and Gillan, it did cross my mind to pick one of those.
I think a supergroup is a loose term because there's different degrees, you know. When I think of a supergroup, I think of Starfleet Project with Eddie Van Halen, Brian May, Alan from REO. You know, that, come on, get any more super than that. You've got Brian May and Eddie Van Halen play guitar. That's pretty damn super.
I mean, that's the thing is, I think a supergroup does have to have some hype behind it, which is something that we didn't really talk about. But did that album even come out?
Well, it came out on vinyl.
Starfleet's an EP. Yeah, it's just a jammy EP.
It's being reissued.
It's not a full album.
It's crap too.
It's coming back out.
Yeah. And it's only coming out because people are so adamant that they put it out, right? That's one of those.
Well,
you know,
Eddie's dead. They want it back out. I get it. It's a money grab, you know.
And Parish, the other one I thought you were going to bring up was Audio Slave, right? Isn't that three quarters Rage and what's his name?
Well, I think it's half and half, isn't it? I think it's
is it?
kind of 50-50.
I thought it was 3 and 1. Okay.
Yeah, well, you might be right, but yeah, I did think about them as well. So yeah, but they all get called supergroups. But are they? You know, is Velvet Revolver really a supergroup when 3 of them are Guns N' Roses? You know. So anyway, I apologise, Grant, for winding you up over.
Oh no, it's all fun.
But I couldn't.
Yeah, that took a turn really fast.
Oh, I love it. It's all about talk, rap, and music. I'm not all worked up. I love it.
All of a sudden, I love these guys now.
No, but that second Damn Yankees album, what went wrong is that Ted started to take control of Damn Yankees. The first album was a good mix of everybody. The second record's too Ted, and I think it even got even worse off on the third one. But we'll never ever hear that, you know.
The other quick point about supergroups is, I mean, it gives the press something to talk about that's really easy and it's kind of exciting, right? So just the describing of the group means people, you know, they like to describe and they like to talk about it and they're curious to see how this works together. So basically, you put a supergroup together, you're guaranteed to get some press about it, right?
Yeah, I remember.
But think about this: we had the same time Damn Yankees pretty much came out. We had Shadow King, who failed miserably.
And you also had Bad English about that time as well, didn't you?
They had hits though.
Yeah, I was just saying they were. Yeah, but I don't know. They didn't seem to have. Well, they did have the hits, but to me, that band was exactly what I thought they would be. Kind of didn't quite work, didn't gel. It was okay, but and it was kind of what I thought Damn Yankees would be like. It would be okay, but as I say, I think the Damn Yankees. I know. You liked them, Grant, because I saw you showing them, which is why I thought I'd wind you up.
Shadow King was Lou Gramm, right?
Yeah.
Lou Gramm and Vivian Campbell.
Vivian Campbell,
yeah. I mean,
Bad English is some cranky guys getting put together that you know aren't going to get along, right?
Two babies and two Journey people.
Yeah,
well, actually, you've got three babies and one Journey. Well, it's kind of a split.
Yeah, well,
never get involved with Journey guys. They're like trouble.
Yeah, I do remember reading Kerrang in 89, 88, something like that, and people talk lots about trumped up Blue Murder a lot before there were any album, because at that time there was talk about John Sykes teaming up with Cozy Powell. We had Ray Gillan was going to sing. There was even talk about Glenn Hughes. There was there was a lot of people around that time. And you also have the and then it became Appice and Franklin, right?
Yeah.
And you also had the Phenomena thing, which was great in the 80s. The one that what was his name again? Tom Galley. Was it Tom Galley? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
who put together, where everybody came in and sang, and a lot of people played on it, and everybody was on that. But it was it had a theme to it. It was more like you said, a sort of superhero thing. You get into this sort of phenomena. The moniker was bigger than the people who worked. Everybody went in and did their bits, and then the albums came out.
Yeah.
Supergroups.
And Pontus, we've got Glenn Hughes as part of that, right? And Glenn Hughes, I was going to think there's two guys who have been in lots of supergroups, Glenn Hughes and Sammy Hagar, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we forgot about Sammy. Sammy, yeah.
I didn't forget about Sammy.
HSAS.
What would I forget about Sammy? But
Montrose was a supergroup, right? You start off with Montrose, HSAS, Circle, Van Halen, all of them, right?
Grumpy Montrose was then, though.
I wouldn't count Montrose because Sammy was unknown when they did Montrose.
Well, okay,
Montrose was the
who
only
knew
known player.
Ronnie? He was in Edgar Winter. No one knew who he was.
But it's a good call, Pontus, on Blue Murder, though, because it's funny because you see Blue Murder like videos on YouTube or whatever, and look at the comments. Everyone's like, Blue Murder should have been huge. They were amazing. Something went wrong with the marketing of this because it should have been a massive record. And that's it's funny. Everyone talks about how great they should have been massive, and they weren't.
They weren't. But I think that album surely needs a remix.
Half of that album is brilliant. Half of it
that album is brilliant, but I do think the drums could need some the echoing,
de-icing,
remixing,
and it's got Tony Franklin's fretless bass from The Firm, which frankly does not do hard rock any favors. That is just a weird flavor of bass for hard rock. Badlands was a minor supergroup, which I actually prefer to the Blue Murder album.
Yeah.
But this is supergroups are a way to generate what we would now call viral marketing, right? Because this is why nerds love supergroups, because it generates people talking. You're like, oh man, wouldn't it be great if we got these guys together?
Well, that's what record companies like supergroups. That's who really like them.
Yeah. And then you've got the most recent supergroup, which to me is the most odd supergroup of all in some ways, which is take half of Generation X and half of the Sex Pistols and create Generation Sex, who are out on tour at the moment. So you've basically got Billy Idol and Tony James with Paul Cook and Steve Jones out there doing sort of half Sex Pistols songs, which is absolutely fantastic, and half Generation X songs, which there's a couple of good ones, but are not nearly as good. But obviously they've got to do half and half. And I saw them play at a club, a small venue near me earlier in the year, Wolverhampton Town Hall. And it was absolutely packed, and it was full of people my age, mostly aged punks with managed to find their leather jackets with the spikes on, etc. as they went out there. But they seem
still
to be,
fits.
Still fits. I couldn't even find my low joy putting it on.
Well, I bet I bet Billy sounded great singing the Sex Pistols.
He was really good. I mean, he was really good. And if you want to see them, there's he was at Glastonbury, or they were at Glastonbury this year, and the whole of the set is on YouTube.
Oh,
so if you wanted to see it, you could watch it on YouTube. But that's definitely an example of marketing, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned, which is why I mentioned it. You're talking about marketing and trying to use the hype, and that's definitely an example of the hype. And then as part of that, you've got Johnny Rotten sort of slagging off Billy Idol, but in the nicest way, because he said the problem with Billy Idol was he was just too nice. He wasn't a proper punk. He was like the Cliff Richard of punk, sort of, And you're thinking, well, it's not really much of an insult, is it? Really?
Well, you know, we did a Billy Idol. We actually did a Generation X show on my channel, and some people chimed in and really didn't think that Generation X were punk at all. I don't know, Parish, how did you look at Generation X?
At the time, they were punk. I mean, they were with the punk bands that I liked at the time. But with hindsight, yeah, they were probably more new wave than punk, really.
That's what people were saying.
They were like the Diet Coke of punk.
Yeah,
but if
probably.
you look at
but at the time they weren't. I mean, you went to the gigs, there was, there were hardcore punk fans there. The same as you'd see at, say, Sham 69 or the UK, the UK Subs or Cockney Rejects. They were exactly the same fan base.
You look at that first.
They were definitely punk.
But you look at that first album. When I look at the first album, the cover, it looks punk to me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But I think Billy Idol, he always had that kind of pop, sort of feel to him that maybe some of the others didn't have. But at the time, I mean, I can see now looking back, they were more new wave. But at the time, they were punk. That's how we saw them.
Yeah.
In hindsight, you can see it. Yeah.
In hindsight, well, in hindsight, we look at a lot like Martin mentioned Montrose. We can look at Montrose now, and it looks like a supergroup. But when it came out, no one knew who any of those guys were. But now, in hindsight, we go, God, that was a supergroup. So a lot of these bands can be reimagined, and
Yeah, but Parish, great call on Rockpile, man. I forgot about Rockpile, and it's like,
oh my God, yeah.
You forget that they put out one record, but really they put out like 4 albums because.
Well, I mean, there was 6. There's 7 if you include the album that they played on, which was I can't remember her name now.
Wasn't Labor of Lust and
you had Labor of Lust. The Nick Lowe albums, you had Labor of Lust. What was the other one? I've got them.
Pure Pop, Jesus of Cool.
Yeah.
Jesus of Cool and Labor of Lust were the 2 Nick Lowe ones. You had Tracks on Wax 4, Repeat When Necessary, and Twanging with the Dave Edmunds ones, and then Seconds of Pleasure was the Rockpile. But Dave Edmunds was married to Carleen Carter, and they actually played as the backing band on one of her albums as well. So you could say that's apart from the fact they didn't sing on it, you could say that's
played on it though. It sounds like Rockpile.
You know the one I mean then. So it's effectively a Rockpile album. Yeah.
Was it Rockpile? Was it named after the studio? Because
no,
that was Rockfield. Sorry,
Rockpile was Dave Edmunds' first album.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't know whether the album was named after I didn't know if the album was named after a record studio. It may have been.
All right, kids, we're probably about at an hour.
All right, give Phil the last word.
Phil.
Yeah, thank you.
Take us out.
Very quickly. First of all, I want to say that many of you have touched on something that's being already discussed amongst us, which is the fact that when there's a lot of friction among members, especially in these new bands or with big established names, that creates a lot of good music. So through the tension, the friction, you actually get the tension actually generates good music. Shout out to Velvet Revolver. That for me is the epitome of a supergroup. You have the best voice of his generation, Scott Weiland, meeting someone like Slash and members of the Guns N' Roses, and they did something for me which was far better than Guns N' Roses. I'm on the right channel. It's a contrarian view, I guess. So, okay. Apart from that, I'll just focus on what I started with, and that is that you guys have been talking about supergroups, and I had this idea, but I think that the bands I had in mind in the end were really side projects. So, again, going back to Mr. Mike Portnoy, Liquid Tension Experiment, it started as basically some kind of side project because Dream Theater were kind of getting stagnant in around 97, 98. Things weren't going well with the record label. Mike Portnoy was in a state of how should I put it? He was very restless. He's a very restless guy. He cannot stay put. He wants to constantly play with another band and with more musicians and play in a different genre and be in like simultaneously 10 different bands. So he started looking for musicians to create a new instrumental project, and he went for Tony Levin, Peter Gabriel, King Crimson, and more. I forget now. The legendary Tony Levin. He went for Jordan Rudess, who had played for a brief time with Dream Theater on tour before he joined Dream Theater, and then he wanted to go for Dimebag Darrell of Pantera. but he didn't. They had the scheduling issues. Then he went for Jim Mateos of Fate's Warning, who as well couldn't make it. So eventually he went for his for the guitar player of Dream Theater, John Petrucci, and you had suddenly two members of Dream Theater meeting Tony Levin and Jordan Rudess, both of whom have played, I think, with Peter Gabriel and with other legendary bands and musicians, and you had some form of supergroup. But at the end of the day, it was really a side project because it was essentially something that Mike Portnoy started, literally on the side. His main band was Dream Theater, but at the same time, he did this other thing, which became very successful. Jordan Rudess joined Dream Theater as a result of the success of Liquid Tension, which of course was very appealing to big prog nerds like myself. They released a second album called Liquid Tension Experiment 2 the year after. And then Mike Portnoy got very busy with theater, and so did Rudess and Petrucci. And they went on a very, very, very long hiatus until COVID and confinement basically put them back together in a room. Also, they all got back together on good terms as Mike Portnoy had left Dream Theater, and there was a lot of fighting and whatnot. And they released their third album. There will never be a fourth album, that's for sure, because this is really a side project. And so is the Neil Morse Band, Similitude of a Dream, and more big prog albums. But yeah, as I said, great musicians getting together from a few other bands. But I think at the end of the day, these are really, maybe if we try to split hairs, these are side projects that I have in mind, and not so much these super groups like Emerson, Lake and Palmer or Velvet Revolver or Temple of the Dog, Pearl Jam meets Soundgarden. So I don't know if we can somehow draw the line and distinguish side projects from super groups. Or if maybe some of these albums are actually just solo albums, like it's a Mike Portnoy solo album, or Temple of the Dog is a Chris Cornell solo album in some way. I don't know.
Yeah, what I think it comes down to is that today people can jump ship very quickly. They are very much they're more, their own consultants in a way. They can play with it whoever they want. Back in the 70s and in the 80s, I think people could, through the record company, they could actually sort of live on a solid band rather than being freelance and doing, that's why Mike Portnoy can do 10 bands, because he's not committed to one band. Yeah. Because the structure of the music business is like that.
But you see, that was a problem.
Yeah, he's not signed to a record label, Yeah.
And that was a problem back in 2009, 2010 when he left Dream Theater, because among other issues that were happening in the band was the fact that this guy just wanted to be in too many side projects. He wanted to do his own thing, which was to play with, many musicians and many bands, because this guy is a very dedicated musician. He loves playing with everyone, everywhere, at the same time. And that was just an issue when you're supposed to be to be faithful to your one, you're married to your band. You cannot just play. And that's what you said earlier, Pontus, about the Beatles, that this split up the band in a way.
Yeah.
All right, great. Call it there.
Yes, we're done. Phil, you have anything else to add before we wrap it up?
I'm good.
I don't know what we have decided here. I think supergroup is a loose term. It all depends. I think
we're a supergroup.
We're a supergroup right here.
Absolutely.
We're a supergroup. Anyway, in the comments, we want to hear from you. We'd love to hear your comments about supergroups.
And Grant, what do we really want to hear from them? We want to hear the answer to how horrible are supergroups?
Yeah, we want, right. I don't know if we've even answered that, but we do want to hear from you. How horrible are supergroups? So leave that down below. If you like what you hear, you want to be on these panels. That is truly
horrible.
It's fantastic.
What can go wrong? This is the example of what can go wrong with a supergroup right here.
There you go.
When the heart rules the mind. I've got it tattooed on my butt.
Oh, God. If you have that tattooed on your body, Reed, I don't know what that means. That's not good. All right. So if you'd like to be on these panels, you can be on here. We have a Patreon. We'd love for you to join. it's a great place to be. You can be on these panels. You can talk music too. We have a Ko-fi, buy us a cup or a pint. We'd love that. We also like donos. We did get a nice dono the other day, like $25. There you go. I would want to appreciate that. But anyway, stay tuned. We've got more great content on the way. And please like, subscribe. I want to thank Phil, Pontus, Tom, the Parish of Rock, and Reed, and of course, Martin. We're all here. Great discussion, even though I don't know if we determined anything. But anyway, we'll see you on the next one, and have a good one.